Your building door access system might be giving attackers access to your corporate network.
So John, I hear you've got a story for us today about some IoT devices that are behaving badly.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Well, they are behaving badly, but it's because they were designed poorly, I guess.
Exactly.
More to the point, these are actually smart building access systems, mostly for like door control type things in corporate environment and whatnot. So it might have like a badge reader or some kind of push button thing to get it, access into a room or something in a corporate building. So these devices are actually by Nortek Security and Control. They're linear eMerge E3 devices, which probably doesn't mean anything to most people. But if you have one of these things, you would probably recognize it. There are several vulnerabilities that a security researcher group, Applied Risk, they discovered these vulnerabilities back in May, notified the company. Company did not take any action. I still am not sure if to date whether they have or not in terms of releasing patches. But the vulnerabilities are pretty high. Many of them are level 10 of 10, which means without any authentication, you can pretty much do some sort of remote code execution, get access to it. So the good news is that from an internet perspective, there are not that many of these exposed to the internet, maybe around 2,400 or so based on what they see, which is a smallish footprint compared to a lot of other things that we see, like the security camera DVRs and whatnot that are widely exposed on the internet. But there appears that there are people actively looking for these, bad actors are actively looking for these devices, recruiting them into a botnet. It's very easy because it's basically got a little embedded Linux like a lot of IoT devices. The remote code execution lets you very easily get into it, drop an implant on there, and use it as part of your botnet for whatever whatever you're interested in doing with your botnet.
Right.
So I guess the thing that I thought was interesting about this is that these devices, unlike security camera DVRs, which a lot of those are in home environments and things like these, this particular device is probably deployed more often in corporate or other types of commercial type footprints. And we do know that, not necessarily with this specific device, but in other cases, we've seen bad actors, especially nation-state actors, use these types of devices as kind of a way to get a foothold into a company. So if they can compromise that device, they might be able to move laterally or whatnot further into the company's network, because sometimes they're in kind of a bastion environment where they've got one end on the internet and one end on the inside corporate network.
Right. It's these devices that get installed that unfortunately usually get forgotten once they're installed, because they do one function, they're set up for that one function, and they're very easy to just sort of forget. And so, in this particular case, we see that sometimes these devices, unfortunately, get exposed to the internet. But even when they're not exposed to the internet, they still pose a potential risk sitting inside of your corporate buildings. You said there's about, what, 2,400 you said?
Something around that.
So, I mean, obviously, I guess when you throw a number like that out, the one thing that you have to realize is that's 2,400 that are visible from the internet. That doesn't mean that you could have one of these devices within your network, you just don't have it exposed, right?
Right.
So which means that you still have the vulnerability if somebody walks into one of your buildings, right, as a guest or whatever it may be, they may be able to plug in and take over one of these devices or use this as a device to get further onto the network, or maybe even just get onto the network. Because if you've got controls in place enough where a visitor just can't plug in, if they find a device that has a vulnerability, they could use that. So the 2,400 is just the exposed. There probably is a ton more of these things that are actually out there. And then I think earlier you had mentioned about the name of the company that makes these things and it not being familiar. I think a lot of people, the problem is that I think a lot of people who are perhaps responsible for security in like big buildings probably wouldn't recognize that name either, right? Because they weren't involved in the purchasing of those that equipment that goes into these buildings. So even looking at this, you might read that story over and go, oh yeah, I don't recognize that name. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't have these devices in your, you know, yeah.
Right. Yeah, but did you have something on that, Jim?
Yeah, well, yeah, and the SonicWall article says that as of February 1st, there still is no patch for this. And, you know, the fact that these were reported in May, that there were at least four vulnerabilities that had a CVSS score of 9.8 or greater, that's a little bit concerning. I would hope that most vendors would react more quickly than that and get the patches out, because, you know, as Manny was saying, that 2,400 on the internet, that's bad enough. I mean, these should not be exposed to the internet. But, you know, the thousands more, maybe tens of thousands more that, as Manny was saying, you know, do the folks internally actually know that they've got these? And, you know, there is no patch available, but even when there is a patch available, will they know how to patch them?
Right. Yeah. And whether they've been compromised or whatnot. What you were saying earlier, I know in a lot of investigations I worked partnering with some of our customers and whatnot, a lot of the building automation stuff, especially access control, lighting in the buildings, a lot of them have like lighting systems that they're managed by like an outside vendor. And they'll use maybe a wireless connection, cellular wireless, to get into it and like control the settings to adjust the lighting and whatnot, you know, on a regular basis, or even remote administration of the building access. So that's something that you also need to consider or be concerned about as, you know, a corporate security person. If you're in the security department, these devices a lot of times are probably not going to be any kind of asset inventory that you might have because they were deployed by maybe a third-party vendor who is contracted to put them into the building for some reason. Yep. So, you know, that's an important consideration.
If they're being controlled from outside, you know, that should at least have some sort of a VPN or something so that only the folks who should be managing it can access it. Yep. Putting these on the internet is not the way to do it.
Right, 100%. Yep. And I guess the one last thought I had while you were talking was, if I was a really motivated attacker and I wanted to stay under the wire, if I was able to get into the building at one point, like maybe I'm an insider threat actor in the building, and I find that you've got this kind of access control system that's unpatched, I might be able to get into it, add my own access cards to it, and then later, after I've been terminated or gone, I can get back in the building as I want because I've, you know, backdoored the access control system to maybe get into the front door of the building or whatnot. So something to be concerned about, obviously. You know, fortunately, I think in most respects with this particular case, the people who are compromising them don't really care that they're building an access control system. They just think it's a Linux box that I can use to DDoS, whatever, do like, you know, mischievous, malicious activities. They're not necessarily targeting the end person. They're just using the device for some compute power that they can, you know, use as part of their botnet. But
something or mine cryptocurrency or something. Yeah.
Right. Yep. And this is just one of many types of devices like this. So this is just yet another example of, we talk about this type of stuff on the show regularly. This is just another case to be mindful of, another you know, typical scenario that we've seen before. So, yeah.